Hi, and welcome to Higher Rock Education. What drives our economy? Spending. Without spending, there'd be no jobs, no income to spend on our necessity and even our toys. When spending drops, businesses cut back. People lose jobs. Who spends? Well, consumers. We call this consumer spending. Businesses. We call this investment spending. Government, surprise, we're going to call that government spending. And foreigners or net exports. Add these up and we get the gross domestic product, which is also the aggregate demand for all of these buyers of goods and services. Economists call this the aggregate demand of an economy. The aggregate demand is the total goods and services purchased in the economy at a given price level. The formula is C for consumer spending, I for investment, G for government spending, and NX for net exports. A graph of the aggregate demand curve looks like this. I must emphasize that the aggregate demand is for the entire economy. It looks like a demand curve studied in microeconomics, right? But it is different. To show the difference, I have added a demand curve for apples. Note that the price level is on the vertical axis of the aggregate demand curve, whereas the price of apples is on the microeconomics graph. Real gross domestic product is on the horizontal axis of the aggregate demand graph rather than the quantity of apples. The price level is a general level of prices in the economy. Usually it's measured by the consumer price index. The price level rises when we have inflation. It's for the entire economy, not just for one good. The microeconomics graph is for a single product, let's say apples. If the price of apples increases, you would probably purchase fewer apples. Perhaps you'd substitute bananas for apples because the price of bananas is not increased. The aggregate demand model assumes that all prices, apples, bananas, and everything else, increase the same amount. So it wouldn't make any sense for a consumer to substitute bananas for apples because of the price. Then why does the aggregate demand curve slope downward? Economists have three reasons. One is the wealth effect. The wealth effect is the effect on the consumer spending when a change in the price level impacts the purchasing power of the consumer. If the price level falls, it costs less money to purchase the same number of goods or services. You may use some of that money to purchase other items, right? So the total amount purchased in the economy is higher at lower prices. Another is the interest rate effect. The interest rate effect impacts business spending, or I. The interest rate effect is the effect that a change in interest rates resulting from a change in the price level has on business spending. Now wait a minute. How does a change in the price level change interest rates? Well, assume there's a drop in the price level. People would spend less on the items they need. Some of that savings would be deposited in banks. People would also have to borrow less because things cost less. The result is banks now are overloaded with cash to lend. In other words, their supply of money to lend increases. The law of supply and demand tells us that when the supply of something is increased, the price is lowered. So interest rates are the price of money. So banks would need to lower their interest rates to attract borrowers. Businesses would take advantage of the lower rates to borrow money to expand. Investment spending increases when the price level falls because interest rates also fall. Finally, the aggregate demand curve slopes downward because of the foreign exchange effect. Purchases in a country may increase following a decrease in the country's price level. This would make the producing country's goods less expensive relative to the foreign country. What does that mean? Well, let's take an example. Assume the price level in Japan decreases. Japanese goods would cost less in the U.S., so Americans may purchase more Japanese goods. Japan's aggregate demand would increase. The wealth effect, interest rate effect, and foreign exchange effect all explain why the aggregate demand curve slopes downwards. But to really grow the economy, the curve needs to shift to the right. So let's explore reasons for a shift in the aggregate demand curve. In each case, there must be a change in behavior that does not result from a change in the price level. So what would happen to change consumer spending? Well, good times may stimulate optimism and a willingness for consumers to spend. For example, a stock market or real estate boom may result in consumers feeling wealthier and buying that extra car. This increases, of course, the aggregate demand. Consumers expecting a recession may delay purchases. A family might want to save more, and this would decrease the aggregate demand curve and push it to the left. What could happen to change investment spending? Well, business attitudes are the key. Businesses who are optimistic about the future and want to grow will invest if they do not have the capacity they need. Or a business may invest to take advantage of the latest technology, which reduces manufacturing costs, or changes in a tax law, such as the investment tax credit or depreciation allowance, may provide an incentive to invest now rather than wait. Government spending amounts to approximately 20% of the real gross domestic product. What could happen to change government spending? Well, an increase in government spending will increase the aggregate demand. So, for example, an increase in national defense spending causes a rightward shift in the aggregate demand curve. Tax and spending policies that put more money in consumers' or businesses' pockets will increase consumer and investment spending. What impacts net export spending? Well, a change in trading agreements may encourage trade with the country. A recession in Greece reduces Greece's aggregate demand, which reduces the demand for U.S. goods and services. Spending drives any economy. Spending by consumers, businesses, governments, and foreigners. Aggregate demand is the demand for all these goods and services at a given price level. It is a measure of all the participants' willingness to spend. The aggregate demand curve slopes downward because at lower price levels, there's a larger aggregate quantity demanded. The aggregate demand curve may also shift depending upon the attitudes of spenders. When optimistic, consumers, businesses, and even foreigners will purchase more, causing a rightward shift in the aggregate demand. When government increases spending, the aggregate demand curve also increases. Countries strive to manipulate the aggregate demand to manage their economies. But to understand this, you really need to understand the aggregate supply as well. To learn more about this lesson and other important economic concepts, please visit our website at higherrockeducation.com. Thank you.